Hello there. My name is Michael Guel, is currently known as Big Mike. This is my colleague here,
Dalton McGee.
and we're going to do a literature review today on a very important study. This study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, very prestigious journal. You've probably heard of this journal. This particular report was written in 1993, but the study was started the year I was born, 1987. And this is really the year that things started to get interesting in the world, not just because I was born, but because the study started as well.
That's a hot take.
Yeah. This study was put on by the Parkinson Study Group. This is a famous study group that they received a grant from the National Institute of Health. So we're immediately going in, we know there's not going to be a lot of bias. No drug companies sponsor the study. And so we like the look of things going in. What do you say, Dalton?
I think it looks like a pretty valid study, and it seems pretty unbiased.
Yeah, pretty unbiased. Their ultimate motivation here is to help patients. Now, the name of the study is DATATOP. Now, we actually love how they make these acronyms. They're probably some of the most creative things in science.
Well,
DATATOP means Deprenyl and Tocopherol antioxidative therapy of Parkinson's.
Yeah, and those acronyms really do make it a lot easier to remember.
Yeah, DATATOP. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
As you can tell by the title, we're testing two different interventions here. One of them is Deprenyl, and the other is something we see a lot, tocopherol, or tocopherol acetate, which is vitamin E. It's an antioxidant commonly used. So what these researchers thought at the time, and what we still think now, is that Parkinson's is a disease caused by oxidative stress. Now, within the normal dopamine metabolism, because dopamine becomes the ultimate neurotransmitter of Parkinson's disease. I think you start to show symptoms of Parkinson's disease when you've lost 50% of the dopamine neurons within your brain. This is when you start to show symptoms such as the resting tremor and what we call bradykinesia or akinesia, and this is like slow movement. And then also, if you notice, as people get older, they start to exhibit like a shuffling gait. You ever notice like older people, they sort of shuffle when they walk and they don't, quite have a stride in their step? These are signs of Parkinson's. Now, we believe this is caused by destruction in the nigrostriatal pathway, which is responsible for movement. So what happens is within the normal metabolism of dopamine, what you do is you produce hydrogen peroxide. You produce hydrogen peroxide when monoamine oxidase metabolizes dopamine. And so you reduce oxygen into hydrogen peroxide, and this can be damaging to the neurons. So we thought we could maybe use tocopherol because it traps peroxide radicals, and we could use that as an antioxidant. But we also thought we could use a monoamine oxidase inhibitor like Deprenyl, because what it does is it stops that oxidative deamination of the dopamine molecule, and it doesn't allow for that hydroxyl radical to be produced. So we're either stopping it after it's produced or we're stopping it before it's produced. Now, so they came in with this idea, and it was a very good idea at the time, and it still is. So if we can catch people with an early Parkinson's disease and we can give them these drugs, maybe it can have a disease-modifying effect to where it can delay the amount of time before we need to use the mainstay drug within Parkinson's, which is known as levodopa. Now, levodopa, as far as symptomatic relief goes, is the best drug in Parkinson's. So levodopa, through the enzyme amino acid decarboxylase, is immediately turned into dopamine in the body. Now, you have to take it with a peripheral decarboxylase inhibitor, so it gets into the central nervous system. But once it's there, you're golden. Now, the problem is we have to continue to escalate the doses of levodopa throughout the disease state as the disease progresses, and this causes more movement disorders. And now these movement disorders are called dyskinesias. Now, Dalton, dyskinesias are sometimes even worse than the disease itself. For instance, orofacial dyskinesias, I don't think you've ever seen this, but this is like the protruding of the lips, the tongue comes out and it wags, and the jaw moves back and forth. You might have seen this at a bar sometimes. It's cocaine stereotypy as well. And then also you'll see flailing of the limbs sometimes when people try to walk or just at rest. And like if you look at someone like Michael J. Fox, he exhibits these dyskinesias even more so than he does Parkinson's because he's had to take so much levodopa that what you're seeing is levodopa-induced dyskinesias.
Yeah.
So what we wanted to do is we wanted to find ways where we can delay the amount of time before you need to start taking levodopa. And then also we thought maybe we can find a disease-modifying therapy that'll slow down that neurodegeneration that happens, because this is a neurodegenerative disease. The dopamine neurons, the pigmented neurons of the nigrostriatal tract, are being destroyed, and if we can slow down the rate at which they're being destroyed, we can put off the disease. The patient might survive for longer, and we call this a disease-modifying effect instead of a symptomatic effect. So that's what they were originally trying to do here, was to find a a disease-modifying effect. But they came in with this idea, because this is a very experienced research group, though. This is not your normal research group. They came in with this idea that selegiline, otherwise known as Deprenyl, had no symptomatic benefit. So it didn't help with motor function or anything. They thought it might just be a drug that had a disease-modifying effect. So they designed the trial according to these ideas. It didn't work out that way, though, of course. It never does. In life, this is what happens. Nothing ever works out like we want it to. So what ended up happening is it did provide a symptomatic effect. It almost immediately improved their motor symptoms as measured through secondary endpoint variables. And however, we also found that it significantly delayed the amount of time before they needed to use levodopa, as found through a hazard ratio. Now the hazard ratio ended up being half, so they accumulated the endpoints at about half the rate in the Deprenyl arm as they did within the placebo arms. So that was a really good result. So a lot of the times these trials will have what we call interim analysis. So an independent data monitoring committee will come in, they'll look at the data, they'll see things, and then they'll give recommendations on how to modify the trial, saying like, okay, you need to do this, you need to do this. They're very bossy. So you almost always take the recommendations of the independent data monitoring committee, and the independent data monitoring committee says, this is an amazing result. We see something that might have a disease-modifying effect in Deprenyl, not in Tocopherol. Tocopherol ends up doing almost nothing. It has a hazard ratio of like 0.97, pretty close to a null effect. Yeah. Which seems to be a trend, by the way. I just want to mention that. So they came in and said, okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to modify this trial, and we want you to give these survivors, these people that had not yet reached the endpoint, because that's what you call the people that haven't reached the endpoint in a Kaplan-Meier analysis, survivors. We want you to do a washout with them. So that means you stop taking the drug completely, and then we see whether or not the benefit is sustained. So the reason you want to do this is just say, was it just a symptomatic benefit that's causing the difference? Or was it the disease-modifying benefit that's causing the difference? And this is kind of genius. So they were able to change up the trial and do this washout period, and they had to do a very long washout period because of the way that Deprenyl works. Deprenyl covalently bonds to the enzyme monoamine oxidase, and that means it takes it out of commission for good, so you have to resynthesize the enzyme. So they needed to give it, I looked it up, it takes 5.6 weeks for you to resynthesize the enzyme. So they chose a 2-month washout period. I don't know what kind of data they had going in, but it ended up being the perfect washout period. And they found a sustained benefit. So not only did they find that this delayed the amount of time before you had to initiate levodopa therapy, which was, by the way, a subjective variable. It wasn't a very objective variable because the patient ultimately decides that, the patient and the caregiver. But they also found that the effect was sustained even after washout. So we thought, you know what, Deprenyl, it might be a great drug, it might have a disease-modifying effect, and also has a symptomatic benefit. So we can use it in early Parkinson's. And now if you look at the guidelines and stuff, which we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, the guidelines are the Bible as far as we're concerned. but Deprenyl can be used as monotherapy in early Parkinson's.
Yeah. And so not only did it offset the effects and elongate the amount of time before they developed Parkinson's, it helped after as well, right?
Well, not before they developed Parkinson's, but before they needed levodopa therapy.
Yeah, that's a therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then what else did you say?
It also had effects after the therapy was ended, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In the washout period. That's
That's
right.
why it's such a great drug.
Well, no, this is what we showed. So, like, the washout period was to show that the benefits weren't just from symptom control,
Yeah.
improving the motor symptoms, but they also might have been from altering the disease and slowing down the rate of neurodegeneration.
Wow.
Excellent question.
Yeah.
I'm so proud you got that. So you actually just extracted that from that little discourse that I gave there.
Of course.
So I must have done a pretty good job.
Yeah, so far. All right. So I'm going to talk to y'all about the methods. And so in this DATATOP trial, there were a total of 800 patients, right? And so they were randomly assigned according to a 2x2 factorial design. And if you're not aware of what that is, it's 4 different groups, and then one of the groups having 2 placebos, one of the groups having 2 active drugs, and then the other 2 groups, vice versa, having 1 active and 1 placebo group.
Right.
And they were all equally divided into all these groups. So, that kind of, I guess, correlates to the unbiased. Am I wrong?
Well, yeah, of course, this is how you want it.
Yeah.
You want, and then you also want the patient characteristics at baseline to be very similar. And so we found out that as far as their motor functioning, and we have this thing called the United Parkinson's Disease Rating System. As far as that goes, at baseline, the patients in the placebo group and the patients in the active arm had very similar baseline characteristics, and we want to see that because it reflects well for the rest of the trial.
And while also being random.
Yes.
And so the patients were giving tocopherol, which they were given 2,000 units of tocopherol, and they were given 10 milligrams of Deprenyl.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then, but let's also mention here that 2,000 international units of vitamin E is extremely high.
Yeah, that's very high.
I actually have never seen a dose this high, and now we found that the doses above 400 IUs international units don't really have much of a benefit. So,
Yeah.
continue. Sorry about that.
Yeah, and they were both taken twice daily, morning and evening, with meals.
Yeah.
So they were reevaluated 1 month after initiation and 3 months after that, and then for the next every 3 months, therefore after.
Yes.
And with a maximum of 24 months of follow-up. So we see here that the evaluation with the Hamilton Depression Scale was carried out at baseline at 1 and 3 months, and at 6 months intervals thereafter. You want to tell us?
Well, okay.
Exactly
So
what
this is a very well accepted way to determine depressive symptoms, and so what we want to see is we want to see also in the symptomatic benefit of these drugs whether or not they help with depression, because as you might imagine, Parkinson's is a fatal disease, and people tend to get very depressed. But also, if there's a dopaminergic deficit or deficit of dopamine, we know this is one of the monoamines that when you have low levels of it, it might be causative in depression.
Yep.
So we want to see what's going on. Can these drugs help? Because this is a big part of it too. It's not just about can these therapies extend survival, or can they extend the amount of time until you need to initiate levodopa? But it's, can you help
The quality of life.
exactly?
All right, very good. So we're going to look at the endpoints. Like Michael said, the primary endpoint was just to reduce the time that they had to get levodopa as a therapy for these early stage Parkinson's patients. We're going to work on the statistical analysis, okay? And due to the intention to treat principle, all subjects were included in the results. So even patients that did not reach endpoint within a given time frame.
Or patients that dropped out. This is a censoring issue.
All p-values were two-tailed. The cumulative portions of probability of reaching the endpoint were estimated via the Kaplan-Meier curve. And so the Kaplan-Meier curve is going to measure survival, am I?
Correct,
Okay.
absolutely.
The endpoint comparisons used also the Pearson's chi-squared.
But let's just make this clear. In this case, it's not their actual survival, but survival in the terms of the point until which they reach the endpoint.
Which they've reached the endpoint.
Yes.
Not death. See the chi-squared test, the stratified long rank test, and Cox proportional hazard regression model.
Yes. So the stratified, the log rank test is used to look at the difference between survival curves. It's just a way of looking at the difference.
And one of the main points of this statistical analysis is looking at the hazard ratio. Am I wrong? So.
And then with some of the secondary endpoints, we also use the analysis of variance, and this is a way of dealing with the difference in mean between different groups, but it's when you have more than two means. So if you had two means, what would you use if you were dealing with a difference of mean between groups? Well, think about it. Think about it from what you've learned in drug lit. Now you have two different groups and you're looking at the difference in means between them. What statistical test would you use?
The difference of mean?
Well, yeah, but it's very common. The student t-test, right?
Oh,
yeah, the student t-test.
Okay.
Now, but in this case, we have more than two means, right? We have four groups.
Yes.
So we have to use a different statistical analysis method. So we use analysis of variance, otherwise known as ANOVA.
Okay. And like we said, the hazard ratio, we're really just measuring the risk among subjects receiving and not receiving the treatment.
And remember, the hazard ratio is a rate, and it allows us, it's not like a relative risk where we only get to see the risk, at the end of the trial, but we get to see it at various subpoints within the trial, and that gives us a lot more information.
Anything else you want to follow up with as far as the results go?
Well, so I think we just need to report what the overall hazard ratio here was, and it was 0.5.
Yeah. Half.
So it was half. So that means they accumulated endpoints at half the rate in the treatment group as they did within the control groups.
Yeah.
Now there's multiple treatment groups and control groups. Now the reason I'm not mentioning tocopherol is because it had almost no effect, the null effect, and the null hypothesis. So Dalton, I've got a question for you.
Go ahead.
At the end of the day, I've harped on this idea of Deprenyl possibly having a disease-modifying effect. Now, your job was to come through the data, right? To come through the data analysis in the trial.
Sure.
Was there anything specific that you came across that was furthermore indicative of a disease-modifying effect for Deprenyl?
So yeah, Big Mike, I actually looked at a subgroup analysis comparing the groups in this study that took Deprenyl and received a symptomatic benefit versus the group that took Deprenyl that did not receive a symptomatic benefit. And so what we saw here is that there was only a 0.02 difference in their hazard ratios of these two groups. And all this does is solidify the fact that this drug not only enhances endpoint, it elongates endpoint, but it also has some neuroprotective effects as well. All right, Big Mike, so I think after looking at this study, we can validify that Deprenyl is a pretty good drug, right?
Yeah, Dalton. So based on this trial that was highly powered with 800 participants, I would say that it has a pretty good proof that Deprenyl is a drug that can be used in early Parkinson's. And I think if I had early Parkinson's, I would use Deprenyl as a strategy to delay the use of levodopa. And then even when I had to initiate levodopa, I would use Deprenyl as a strategy to reduce my levodopa dose because it has a levodopa sparing effect. So I think, yes, that's an excellent drug, and this study validates that point, as you said.